Hello, my name is Ragnhildur and I work as a project manager at Matís in Iceland, and I've been working in the FarFish project now for the past 4 years. And I will be today explaining and talking about the FarFish management recommendations. One of the key components of the FarFish project was to develop and test a framework and good practice guidelines for making the so-called management recommendations. This approach and the guidelines apply to the long-distance fleets that are fishing in the waters of other countries, such as the EU fleets operating under the SFPA agreements. This approach essentially aims to strengthen the governance of these fisheries and to improve the cooperation between the coastal state authorities and the EU resource users. The approach that we used here to create the management recommendations is based on the results-based management concept, or the RBM. The RBM was first introduced in the Common Fisheries Policy in 2009 to reduce micromanagement and increase the degree of co-management by transferring part of the responsibility for fisheries management to the resource users. A practical framework to RBM was developed in the European project EcoFishman, where it was conceptualized as a contract situation then between the authorities and the operators. And this meant that the relevant authorities set specific and measurable objectives to be achieved, leaving then the resource users or the operators to propose ways to achieve these management objectives. And as you can see here on the slide, so it's the authorities that set specific measurable objectives to be achieved, and then it is the resource users or the operators that propose and practical means on how to achieve the objectives, and then to implement them and document their success. So building on what was created in the EcoFishman project, which I mentioned earlier, we took that approach and implemented it in the FarFish 6 case studies, which you've learned by now are 2 high seas areas and then 4 SFPA case studies. So what we did, we created management recommendations through an iterative process. So first, early on in the project, we developed the first version of the management recommendations for all the case studies, which went through an audit and obviously as well went through some developments in the meantime, including stakeholder comments. And then to create the second management recommendations later on in the project. Alongside this work, we also created the guidelines. We did that through an open process, which I will explain a bit further later. But we developed a few drafts throughout the lifetime of the project, incorporating both the lessons learned from the case studies and stakeholder comments to create then the final version of the guidelines. So the final version now of these guidelines are in the final stretch of being formulated into a low-level European voluntary SEN standard. And the guidelines are called Good Practice Guidelines for Developing Management Recommendations for the EU fleet operating outside European waters. So like I mentioned earlier, this was an open process. What we did through this development, we incorporated all the lessons learned from the implementation in the FarFish case studies throughout the project. And then we went through this open SEN process, which is an open process which anyone can sign up to. So we had quite a lot of stakeholders participating in the process, and it included a number of both physical and online meetings with stakeholders, and then 2 public review and commenting phases where we produced public drafts that then got comments, then we then implemented to the extent possible. And now I want to just briefly go through the process that we've developed. It's a 7-step process, and I'm going to go briefly through each step here. It starts with a pre-imitation dialogue. So this is when the authorities initiate a dialogue with the operators. In the MR process, the authorities are usually the coastal state authorities in question. For the authorities, this step means identifying all key operators that are operating in the area in question, contacting their representatives, and inviting them to this pre-invitation dialogue. Here, a discussion of common management goals and objectives starts to see if both and all parties are on the same page, and if this meeting concludes with a common understanding to initiate the MR process, then we can move on to the next step. So if both parties agree to initiate the process, the next step is then the MR invitation. So that is submitted by the coastal state authorities to the operators. The MR invitation includes the so-called outcome targets, which are specific and measurable targets set by the authorities that the operators must then address. And I will explain that a bit later. The operators then take this MR invitation, they discuss amongst them and determine means to reach the outcome targets specified in the invitation, to then to create the MR proposal. So it's the authorities that create this MR proposal now and hand that over to the authorities. So the MR proposal then contains these strategies that the operators propose to reach the outcome targets. So once the operators have submitted this initial MR proposal, the authorities will take this proposal, evaluate whether the proposed measures meet all the requirements and are aligned with the outcome targets. So before I go further, I want to briefly explain the outcome targets. To create the outcome targets, the authorities first set a broader management objectives, which are then objectives for the fishery in question, then based on existing environmental, social, and economic objectives or policies and or current management challenges. So based on these broader management objectives, the authorities formulate specific outcome targets, which are then listed in the MR invitation. So the outcome targets are then more specific and measurable with more specific outcome targets and are measurable and with specific indicators. And then it is up to then the operators to identify specific management measures in the MR proposal that together then aim to reach the outcome targets. So after the operators have submitted the MR proposal, it is then up to the authorities, to evaluate the MR proposal. And that can be concluded by either them declining it and sending it back to the operators, or they approve it potentially with any necessary revisions. If approved, we move on to the implementation step. So once the MR proposal has been approved by the authorities, the next step is this implementation step. The operators then implement the measures proposed, and they also have to supply the auditors with detailed documentation of the implementation process to evaluate both the implementation process itself and also the progress towards reaching the outcome targets. So when it comes to the audit itself, which is performed either by a third-party auditor or a dedicated auditing team, there should be sufficient data and information available provided by the operators. The documentation that is provided by the operators is then reviewed by the auditor, and the auditor or the auditing team will then evaluate whether or not, or to the extent to which, the outcome targets are being achieved by assessing the selected indicators. And if, and really only if, the audit concludes that the outcome targets are not or only partially being achieved, the authority can request an MR revision. And that will be requested from the operators then. And then if that is the case, that they require a revision of the MR proposal, it is sent back to the operators, and then the assessment provided by the auditing team can then serve as a basis for drafting a modified new version of the MR proposal. So that is a brief introduction to the steps. So as I mentioned, we went through this process in all the case studies, and you can find information on the outcome targets, the management objectives. Each outcome target is given a level of either being obligatory or recommended within the MR invitation. So you can find all these information on the FarFish website. Unfortunately, I will not have time to go through all this, but you can see here just brief introduction. And if we look, for example, at the Mauritanian, you can see here that there are 5 different outcome targets. You have the priority level of either being obligatory, as that means that they have to be met, and then recommended as well. And then you have the action that was performed within the FarFish project during the project lifetime. So I encourage you to go on the FarFish website and read all about our findings in these different case studies, and then stay tuned for the standard that will be published any day now. Thank you very much.